You know what's really interesting about the Beatles?
Huh. You mean there's more to the Beatles than we've already talked about?
Yes, there's more, quite a bit of it. For example, did you know that the cultural critics panned the Beatles when they first came to the United States?
I guess you're right. The establishment thought they had flopped when they debuted on Ed Sullivan.
Exactly. That's what people don't understand today. They faced intense cultural resistance from the establishment.
Yeah, the same thing happened to the Spice Girls. The Spice Girls, they weren't supposed to last 2 weeks, but it's been 30 years since their breakthrough, and they have a new album out.
You're comparing the Spice Girls to the Beatles.
I'm not saying we should start a podcast called Spice Girls Rewind. I'm just saying people really sold them short.
Yeah, just like the Beatles, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it is totally wild to think about them as underdogs today, given the towering legacy they have now. But if you rewind to the morning of February 10th, 1964, the sheer hostility they faced it's staggering.
Right, so put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you're sitting in a suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York on that specific morning.
Okay, eating those warm eggs and toast.
Exactly. And the night before, 73 million people tuned in to watch their American television debut on The Ed Sullivan Show.
Which is like a massive, unprecedented chunk of the entire United States population.
By any measurable metric, it was a historic triumph. But the contrast of the next morning is just so jarring.
Yeah, because they're sitting around the hotel room, right?
Yep.
And they are reading the morning papers. And what they're reading isn't praise at all.
Not even close.
It is an absolute unmitigated bloodbath, like a total critical slaughter.
The words the establishment critics used were beyond dismissive. I mean, they were downright vicious. Look at the New York Herald Tribune, for example.
Oh, wow. Yeah, they did not hold back.
They ran this massive front-page headline that just read, "Beatles bomb on TV."
Bomb on TV.
They blasted the performance for an absence of talent and literally complained that the band, quote, could not carry a tune across the Atlantic.
That is just brutal. And, the so-called highbrow papers they piled on with just as much venom. The New York Times TV critic completely brushed them off.
What did they say?
They called the band a fine mass placebo.
A placebo?
Yeah, just a fake sugar pill to pacify the gullible masses. And Newsweek called the musical performance a near disaster. They actually described the visual experience as a nightmare.
A nightmare. There is this one quote that perfectly captures the arrogance of the era. The music critic Theodore Strongen wrote this incredibly dense, pompous takedown.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
He said, "The Beatles' vocal quality can be described as hoarsely incoherent, with the minimal enunciation necessary to communicate the schematic."
Hoarsely incoherent. I mean, he was trying so desperately to sound intellectually superior, right? While completely missing the raw energy of the art right in front of his face.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because, to me, it's like a rookie quarterback stepping onto the field, throwing 5 perfect touchdowns to win the Super Bowl, and the next morning, the sports pages unanimously agree that he doesn't know how to hold a football.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
Why was the media so uniquely, venomously vicious to these 4 guys playing pop songs?
Well, at its core, the critics were attacking the concept of overnight success.
Right.
The establishment gatekeepers absolutely loathe the idea of anyone skipping the line.
Yeah.
So they conveniently ignored the reality of the band's history.
They completely erased the years of grueling, back-breaking work these guys had already put in.
Exactly. They weren't an overnight success at all. The critics were completely blind to the thousands of hours they spent playing these 8-hour sets in the grimiest, most dangerous underground clubs in Hamburg, Germany.
Playing until they were physically exhausted, sleeping in cramped, freezing quarters behind movie theater screens.
Taking uppers just to survive the schedule.
Playing the bass and their guitars until their fingers literally bled. I mean, they had earned every ounce of their tightness as a band.
Yeah, but the establishment critics, they just saw 4 cocky kids who seemingly dropped out of the sky to steal the spotlight without paying their dues.
But John Lennon's reaction to this tidal wave of negativity is totally fascinating.
It is. Because of that brutal apprenticeship in Hamburg and, dealing with the ruthless British tabloids, they were practically bulletproof.
Right. Lennon just shrugged off the New York papers. He said something like, "Trying to please everybody is impossible. You'd end up in the middle with nobody liking you."
Which is an incredibly mature, grounded perspective for a guy in his early 20s eating cold hotel toast, while the entire American press establishment calls him a talentless hack.
Totally. But because the records kept selling millions of copies, the gatekeepers quickly realized that attacking the music wasn't working.
Nope. so they pivoted.
Right, they pivoted to a target they thought they could destroy: the band's physical appearance.
The grooming panic.
The sheer, unadulterated hysteria over their haircuts.
Which is hilarious to look at now, right? I mean, you look at photos of them from early 1964, and their hair looks incredibly mild.
It covers their foreheads and barely touches their collars.
It is the definition of conservative, milquetoast grooming by modern standards.
But in the context of the early 1960s, it was treated like a legitimate existential threat to the social order.
Oh, absolutely. Syndicated columnists like Paul Jones weren't just unimpressed, they were deeply personally offended.
Yeah, he complained that their shaggy mops made them look like Moe of the Three Stooges.
And he went so far as to demand that CDS fire Ed Sullivan for wasting precious prime television time.
Think about that for a second. Demanding a television icon be fired over a haircut.
And it triggered a massive ripple effect in everyday life, too. By 1965, schools across the country were instituting strict, punitive crackdowns on hair lengths for boys.
You had headmasters sending kids home, famously justifying these strict rules by declaring a sloppy head is indicative of a sloppy mind.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Why did hair actually matter so much to these adults?
Right. How on earth does a simple haircut threaten the very foundation of society? We are talking about bangs, not bombs.
What's fascinating here is the post-World War II context. You have to step into the mindset of the adults running the country in 1964.
Okay, setting the scene.
Ever since the war, the close-cropped, military-style crew cut was the absolute default uniform for men.
It wasn't just a style choice, it was a visual shorthand for American discipline.
Exactly. It meant you respected authority, it meant patriotism, and a very traditional, rigid definition of masculinity.
So when millions of teenagers suddenly wanted to let their hair grow out even an inch over their ears,
it was perceived as an act of rebellion. The hair was a visual flag for a new generation, openly rejecting the rigid, militaristic control of the post-war era.
Before they even played a single note, those haircuts torched the third rail of American social conformity.
And that fear of a generation breaking ranks didn't just stay isolated in American barbershops or high school principal offices.
No, it escalated incredibly fast. It went straight to the highest levels of international politics and religion. It sparked a genuine global political freakout.
The panic was everywhere. The famous evangelist Billy Graham actually broke his own strict, self-imposed rule against watching television on the Sabbath just to watch their performance.
Really?
Yeah. Specifically so he could publicly dismiss them as a passing phase.
Wow. But Graham was mild compared to the political extremes. Let's look at the intense reaction from the extreme right wing first.
Right.
You had the Reverend David Nobel, who led the Christian Crusade. He published these wildly intense, widely distributed pamphlets warning that the band were anti-Christ beatniks.
And he took it a step further, claiming they were actively destroying the morals of American youth to facilitate a Moscow-backed communist takeover of the country.
He genuinely believed the rhythm of the music was a hypnotic tool for Soviet subversion.
Right, because the irony of the situation is just too incredible to ignore once you see how the Soviets reacted.
It is the ultimate historical irony. Because if you flip to the exact opposite side of the ideological globe, to the extreme left-wing reaction,
the Soviet state newspaper, Pravda, was claiming the exact opposite.
They published articles declaring that the band was a capitalist plot orchestrated by the Western ruling classes.
The Soviets claimed the music was designed to distract the working-class youth from engaging in socialist politics and revolution.
So both the American anti-communists and the Soviet communists looked at the exact same four guys with guitars and elevated them into their ultimate ideological boogeyman.
They both saw their worst nightmare perfectly reflected in a pop group.
The absurdity of it resulted in actual staggering international bans.
Yeah, Israel flat out refused to let them enter the country to perform. They officially cited concerns that the band would cause attacks of mass hysteria among their youth.
And in Indonesia, the government literally burned their records in the streets to preserve national identity.
Over in East Germany, the authorities blamed them for causing a nationwide cultural crisis.
But underneath all of this global political panic and all the moralizing about hair and discipline, there was a deeply seated, almost unspoken artistic insecurity in America.
Totally. The establishment wasn't just morally outraged, they felt culturally robbed.
The perceived theft of American culture.
Right. If you look at the historical flow of popular music up until that moment, genres like jazz, blues, country, and early rock and roll had almost exclusively been exported from America to Britain.
The cultural river flowed strictly west to east.
So the idea that a British band could suddenly reverse that flow-taking American-rooted music, transforming it, electrifying it, and exporting it back westward, struck many American commentators as pure cultural theft.
The American jazz establishment was practically dripping with condescension. The noted critic Martin Williams completely dismissed their sound, calling it a strident imitation of American Negro blues singing.
And the Saturday Evening Post just waved them away as a press agent's marketing trick.
They literally called it an overnight success story written by publicists, assuming there's absolutely no musical substance there at all.
But by focusing on the chords and the hype, the establishment was completely missing the real revolution of 1964.
The most dangerous thing about them wasn't their haircuts or their screaming fans, it was their self-sufficient, democratic model.
This is the part that completely redefined modern music. We have to talk about how the music industry actually functioned before they arrived.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the traditional pop hit-making factories in America, places like the Brill Building or Tin Pan Alley, were terrified.
Because before 1964, the music industry was a very strict, highly controlled machinery. It operated like a Detroit auto assembly line.
You had a rigidly defined hierarchy. Professional songwriters sat in tiny cubicles writing the sheet music. Professional managers and A&R men selected the songs.
They hired anonymous backing bands to play the instruments. And finally, professional, highly groomed singers were brought in just to stand at the microphone and deliver the vocal.
The singer was just the final coat of paint on a factory product.
And suddenly you have these four working-class guys from an industrial port city in England. They couldn't conventionally read or write sheet music.
But they wrote their own songs, they played their own instruments, they sang their own harmonies.
They operated entirely outside the conventional pop industry machinery.
They proved to an entire generation of kids that you didn't need the establishment's permission or their expensive factories to make a hit.
You just needed some cheap instruments and your friends.
And that DIY revolution terrified the gatekeepers far more than the screaming fans ever could. Because it meant the gatekeepers themselves were suddenly obsolete.
The factory owners were losing control of the factory.
Which brings into sharp focus the spin cycle of history. Because the establishment's absolute smug certainty in 1964 looks incredibly hilarious in hindsight.
Especially when you see how desperately they scrambled to change their tune just a few years later.
The pivot is genuinely staggering. Fast forward just 3 years to 1967.
Oh, here we go.
The exact same establishment, the very same critics who called them a fad and a mass placebo, are suddenly tripping over themselves to declare the Sgt. Pepper album a work of undisputed, transcendent genius.
The release of Sgt. Pepper forced a complete critical surrender. The wheel of histrionic hyperbole had turned full circle.
The guys who were told they couldn't carry a tune across the Atlantic were suddenly universally recognized by the highbrow press for their unparalleled artistry.
But what's crucial to realize is that this pattern, this defensive wheel of resistance, repeats constantly throughout history.
It is practically the oldest story in popular culture. The old guard always panics when the new guard arrives.
It happens every single time something genuinely new emerges. Look back at the 1940s. Frank Sinatra, who ironically would later denounce this very band, was completely dismissed by the establishment as a dangerous teenage fad.
Parents and cultural commentators were deeply alarmed by the screaming Bobby Soxers swooning over him.
Then you hit 1956, and Elvis Presley faces the exact same contempt, the same moral panic over his hair, same muttering from the old guard about his obscene and animalistic dancing on television.
And in 1964, the Rolling Stones were literally turned away from a hotel because management judged their casual appearance to be too shabby and insulting.
In 1965, Bob Dylan goes electric at the Newport Folk Festival, and the folk purists completely lose their minds, literally shouting Judas at him from the audience because he dared to change the acoustic rules.
And the cycle just keeps spinning. Punk music faced the exact same intense moral panic and establishment bans in 1977.
Hip-hop faced immense establishment resistance, censorship attempts, and outright dismissal throughout the 1980s and 1990s.
It operates like clockwork. So what does this all mean? Whenever a genuinely new cultural phenomenon arrives, one that actually speaks a new language to a new generation rather than just defending the existing taste hierarchy, the people most heavily invested in that old hierarchy make the absolute loudest, worst noise.
Ringo Starr summed up this phenomenon beautifully years later. Reflecting on all of it, he said, "Every generation finds its own music. It's the one thing that belongs to them and not their parents. It doesn't matter if it's the Beatles or whatever comes next. It's their own discovery."
So when you look at all of this, it means you have to view history with a healthy sense of humor. The ultimate irony here is just delicious.
It is.
Think back to the Herald Tribune columnists who confidently wrote on the front page that they could not carry a tune.
The newspaper that ran that page one takedown, the New York Herald Tribune, completely folded and died just 2 years later in 1966.
Meanwhile, I Want to Hold Your Hand still dominates the radio and streaming playlists today. The establishment lost the war because they fundamentally misunderstood a basic law of culture. Change isn't something you can write a bad review about and hope it goes away.
Which leaves me thinking about where the music industry is today. We currently live in an era where modern pop music is so often algorithmically perfected.
Right, very precise.
It's highly sanitized, focus grouped, and perfectly managed by massive PR teams to ensure maximum broad appeal with the absolute minimum amount of friction.
Definitely.
So it makes me wonder, are we actually entirely overdue for a new wave of hoarsely incoherent rebels to come along and terrify the establishment all over again? What will the next mop talk look like that makes the current gatekeepers completely lose their minds?
Well, thanks for joining us today. Whenever you feel like knowing more about the Beatles, visit us at BeatlesRewind.com. It's the Beatles, all day, every day, 8 days a week. Cass, we'll do it again tomorrow.
I sure will.
Until next time, when you listen,
Your mind conducts its own symphony.